So we have two guests today, but one is a guest and one is not really a guest. Morgan Livingston. I've met Morgan Livingston, and some of you will know her, some of you won't. She's been coming to church here for many years, and and her family. And at times she doesn't live in the area, but she's come back and she helps with youth ministry. And I remember the first time I met Morgan was at the community center at a health expo of some kind. And the first time I met the family over there, and they were wonderful. And now she's back in the area, and she's working for an organization called Pennsylvania Orphan Alliance. And her boss, the executive director, Vince Smith, is here, and he's going to share the message with us. And then together they're going to share a little bit about what they do. And all of this is for an invitation as another way in which we can put hands and feet to the gospel and be Jesus to the people in the community in which we live. And they're doing some marvelous work. The best introduction that I can give of who is Vince, he tells me he's a pastor and a cowboy. And so I think you'll like hearing some of his stories and enjoy him. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Vince, and he's going to bring the word for us today.
Thanks again, guy. Appreciate it. Good morning, One Life. It's great to be with you today. Thanks for allowing us to be here. I want to introduce you to my family really quickly here on the screen. My wife and I have been married for almost 28 years. We've been foster parents for 14. We've had 24 children in our home in those last 14 years, and 3 of them stuck. Our children's names are Kara, Katie, Carly, Kaylin, Callie, and Caden. They range in age from 26 down to 8 years old, and we graduated college and started kindergarten on the same year. So we are not getting bored at our house. But I want to give you a quick introduction to them. And I'm looking forward to really just sharing from God's Word a little bit this morning, and then doing a little bit of an invite into some next steps opportunity here in your community. As soon as children are old enough to speak, one of the first questions that parents ask is, how big are you? And how do they respond? Right? How big? They say, so big, and then we stretch our arms, and we want our kids to know that they're growing, that they're not small, and that we know that the way they think of themselves matter. But today I want to ask us a more important question. How big is your God? How big is Christ in your life? And we're going to talk about that for a while, and then again, I'm going to do some storytelling and just inviting you into some next steps. But I strongly believe that the way that you and I live is a consequence of the size of our God. The way we view our God determines how we live. And the problem that many of us have is that our God is too small. And when we wake up in the morning with a small God, then we're going to start to think that life depends on us, and our circumstances determine our moods and how we feel. When human beings shrink God, they start to offer prayers without faith, work without passion, service without joy, suffering without hope. It starts to result in fear and retreat and a loss of vision and just a failure to persevere in the things that matter in life. But I think it's just a great time to start writing some stories with God's help that are worth retelling. God has a purpose and a plan for each one of your lives, and it's a no-coasting plan, as we're going to talk about today. So I just want to make sure that we keep our great big God in perspective. And the good news, as we're about to see, is that the plan doesn't really need to be all that complicated. You just need to do something. In 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 1 to 23, we see the story of Jonathan and his armor bearer. And it says this: one day Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come on, let's go over to where the Philistines have their outpost." But Jonathan did not tell his father what he was doing. Meanwhile, Saul and his 600 men were camped on the outskirts of Gibeah around the pomegranate tree at Migron. No one realized that Jonathan had left the Israelite camp. To reach the Philistine outpost, Jonathan had to go down between two rocky cliffs that were called Bozez and Seneh. The cliff on the north was in front of Michmash, and the one on the south was in front of Geba. Let's go across to the outpost of those pagans, Jonathan said to his armor bearer. Perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. Do what you think is best, the armor bearer replied. I'm with you completely, whatever you decide. All right then, Jonathan told him, we're going to cross over and we're going to let them see us. If they say to us, stay where you are or we'll kill you, then we're going to stop and not go up to them. But if they say, come on up and fight, then we're going to go up. That's going to be the Lord's sign that he's going to help us defeat them. And when the Philistines saw them coming, they shouted, look, the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes. Then the men from the outpost shouted to Jonathan, come on up here and we're going to teach you a lesson. Come on, climb right behind me, Jonathan said to his armor bearer, for the Lord will help us defeat them. So they climbed up using both hands and feet, and the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed those who came behind them. They killed some 20 men in all, and their bodies were scattered over about half an acre. I always say it's a great bedtime story for your kids. Suddenly, panic broke out in the Philistine army, both in the camp and in the field, including even the outpost and the raiding parties. And just then, an earthquake struck and everyone was terrified. Then Saul and all his men rushed out to the battle, and they found the Philistines killing each other. There was terrible confusion everywhere, so the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle continued to rage even beyond Bethaven. I love this story in so many ways. And here's what I know about the Bible. The Bible is full of mentors, more than 400 of them. Some are good mentors, some are bad mentors, but we can learn from all of them. And in this story, we have Saul, who wasn't a great mentor. Then we have Jonathan and his armor bearer that we really want to learn some things from this morning. But what I've learned over the years is that bad things happen to good people who choose to hang out in neutral. I want to show you a picture here a guy sent me a few weeks ago. This guy was at Lake Erie trying to get his boat out of the water, and he left it in neutral, and this is what happened. Bad things happen to good people that leave it in neutral. A couple years ago, my wife had gone grocery shopping, and I spent the morning fixing fence at our house, and she had come in the house after grocery shopping, and when she got in the house, I looked out our back window, and our car was down in the middle of the field. It had gone through all of the fence that I just fixed. I'm like, what's going on, honey? Apparently, we left the car in neutral. Bad things happen to good people that leave it in neutral. It's kind of humorous sometimes with a vehicle, but in life, God has a no-coasting plan for us. And here we have a dad in this story that's stuck in neutral, sitting under a pomegranate tree, and a son that realizes he can't tell his dad what he's about to do, because if he tells his dad's going to try to talk him out of it. Henry David Thoreau said, most men live lives of quiet desperation, and they go to the grave with a song still in them. Saul focused way too much on not doing anything wrong. He was playing it safe, and he spent way too little time trying to do something right. He tried to preserve his kingdom rather than making God's name great. And I'm not convinced that the greatest tragedy is the things that we do wrong. It was Albert Schweitzer who said the tragedy of life is what dies inside a man while he lives. I think too many of us are playing not to lose instead of playing to win. What we see in this story is that Israel's held at bay by a battalion of Philistines, and they control this pass at Michmash. And what we have is the leader of the Israelite army sitting underneath a pomegranate tree doing nothing. He was afraid. He didn't have his eyes on the maker of the mountains. He had his eyes on the mountains. So he wasn't playing to win. Instead, he was playing just not to lose. And instead of fighting on the front lines, he's sitting on the sidelines. And we see that this isn't an isolated incident. Saul was a coaster. A couple of chapters later, we see that the Philistines are on one bank and the Israelites are on another. And for 40 days, Goliath comes down to the valley and he challenges the Israelite army. And for 40 days, Saul sits on the sidelines doing nothing, cowering in fear, until David, a little shepherd boy, comes along and has to do the fighting for him. The Bible tells us that Saul is head and shoulders taller than any other Israelite. So the only Israelite that's tall enough in stature to go fight this giant is cowardly and sitting on the sidelines, and he lets a little shepherd boy do his fighting for him. He's a do-nothing kind of guy. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, it tells us that faith is being sure of what we hope for. It's being sure of what we do not see. When our eyes are fixed on Jesus, we see the mountain mover. We don't see the mountains. And then we go to verse 6 in Hebrews 11. It says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. Those who come to God must believe that he exists, and that they must believe that he rewards those who look to him. Faith can only happen as a liver of life, not as a sideliner. Faith is an action, and Jonathan understood this. Jonathan was seeking God. He believed that God exists. He believed that if he put his faith into action, God would show up. And when we do the same thing, it pleases God. Saul's sitting on the sidelines. The Bible tells us that nobody was aware that Jonathan had left. He's tired of sitting on the sidelines. He's ready for some action. So he says to his armor bearer, let's go over to the Philistines, and perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Because nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. There is faith written all over this statement. And then his armor bearer replied, I'm with you completely, whatever you decide. I love the armor bearer's response. This guy is a gem. We all need armor bearers like this in our story. And I think we underestimate the importance of these armor bearers. We need people like him who are with us completely. They're willing to pray for us. They're willing to believe in us. They're willing to encourage us. They're going to go fight with us on behalf of kingdom stuff, whatever we decide. Even if we are making some questionable decisions, they're going to give it a shot with us anyway. Not all of us can be Jonathans. Not all of us should be Jonathans. But all of us can absolutely be an armor bearer. We can choose to get in on the action. And in fact, we must choose to get in on the action. You've heard the parable of the talents. There's the one guy who just kind of sat it out. He was given the talent, but he took it and he buried it in the ground until his master came back. And when his master came back, he uncovered that treasure and he gave it back to the master. And he said, here's what you've given me. And the Bible tells us that the master looked at him and said, you wicked and lazy servant. This guy had put it in neutral. He did nothing with what he had been given. And his master said, you should have at least put it in the bank where it would have collected interest. See, neutral living in the Bible was defined as wicked. And ultimately, you and I have a decision to make. It's a decision we make. I'll be proactive, or I'll align myself with those who are being proactive on behalf of the kingdom. But I'm not okay to just sit on the sidelines and not put it in gear. Most people spend their entire lives waiting for something to happen, for something amazing to come along. And sometimes what we call waiting on God really is just a lack of faith. It's sitting under a pomegranate tree while we should be out stirring up some battles. It's burying our talents when we should be out taking some risks and investing them. It's holding on to our time and our talent and our treasures when we should be out sowing them generously. As a pastor for 25 years, I've heard so many people say that they felt like God was calling them to go into missions. And I'll talk to them a year and a half later and say, how's that going? And they'll say they're still praying about it. Or worse yet, they'll say, I went home and I talked to my parents about it, and my parents talked me out of it because they're afraid of the risk that was involved. And that is not an insignificant part of what we see in this story. As parents, if you're a parent, I hope we can instill faith into our children to go take and do things for the kingdom of God, not hold them back for what God is whispering into their hearts and their souls. If the Holy Spirit has whispered, maybe it's through a sermon, maybe it's through a small group leader that challenged you, maybe it's just something that God's planted inside of your heart. That thing that he's planted inside of you is a whisper from God to you, and it's your stewardship responsibility to do something with it. Maybe God said, be generous, or maybe he said to sign up to serve or to go on a mission trip or sponsor a child. Maybe he said, forgive an enemy. Maybe he said, actively pray or invite a neighbor to church or share your faith or write a big check. I don't know what it is that God said to you, but if he's whispered it, don't delay. Maybe you were invited by a Jonathan into a battle where perhaps God would show up, but you respectfully declined and you joined Saul. And sometimes you've even couched that decline in spiritual terms where you've said, I need to pray about it. Can I just say, if that's you, please stop it. We need you to show up and respond to God's invitation on your life. The Holy Spirit spoke, now obey. Put it in gear. I love James chapter 2, verse 17. It says, in the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, show you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I'm going to show you my faith by my deeds. See, God-given opportunities often come disguised as dead ends, and how we react when we come to the end will determine our destiny. See, we can cower in fear, and we can run away from our greatest challenges, or we can chase our God-ordained destiny by seizing that God-ordained opportunity. So again, today, I just want to ask, is there a whisper from God on your life? That idea, that invitation is your opportunity. And I'll go so far as to say I believe it's your stewardship responsibility. And sure, it may be a crazy idea, but that seems to be where God specializes. Proactive waiting is starting towards the Philistine army and waiting for God's response. And maybe you've heard Jim Elliot's quote where he says it's hard to steer a parked car. Get moving. God will move you along the way. But sitting under a pomegranate tree doesn't give God opportunity to steer. Sometimes the smallest step in the right direction ends up being the biggest step of your life. So tiptoe if you must, but take the step. This plan of Jonathan's, I love the plan. I love the plan because it's a terrible plan. It's so bad. Who says, let's go walk out in the middle of the daylight and let the army see us, and if they say come up to us, then we'll go. If I'm making the plan, I'm thinking let's do the element of surprise. Let's wait until it's dark and let's sneak up on them in their tents. Or maybe if they start to fall off the cliffs, then that's our sign that we're supposed to go up and fight. It's a terrible plan. It makes no military sense, but it's got faith written all over it. He says, see, Jonathan has this modus operandi where he says, perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. The Bible tells us that they climbed that cliff using both hands and feet. I've not been in too many sword fights except with my 8-year-old with a little Nerf, sword. But I can imagine after climbing a cliff that you're going to be a little bit worn out and not ready to do a sword fight. But this guy had a modus operandi. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. So they climb the cliff. They defeat the entire Philistine battalion. They trigger a panic in the army. And the Philistines begin to flee. Please don't miss this. The course of Israel's history was changed by one man with the right mindset. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. See, what if Jonathan had sat on the sideline like the rest of the Israelites? If Jonathan hadn't done anything, then nothing would have happened. And some of you came here today to hear just this. You might have been hoping for something different, but that's as deep as it's going to get. Maybe today you just need to do something. God wants you to do something, and by so doing, you could very well save a family or a child or a church or a community or a nation. This story is so much more about God and how God shows up when we have enough faith to seek him. He will reward us when we walk into that space. And then an earthquake struck and everyone was terrified. I haven't experienced a whole lot of earthquakes in my life, but I've seen God do some supernatural stuff. In 1997, I was enjoying the opportunity. I was working at South Branch Farms where Morgan was born, and her parents, Bob Livingston was my boss at the time at this farm, and I loved the job. But God was stirring some stuff in my heart and in our hearts. And I was thinking someday I was going to start a children's ranch where I was going to put cows and kids together. And I had these plans of how I was going to go make all of this money so that we could make this happen. And my wife would just look at me and like, Vince, bad ideas. So we did agree that we needed to pray together. And so for 30 days, we started to pray that God would give us clarity on what our next steps were supposed to be. So on April 1st, 1997, it was the end of that 30 days. And when we woke up in the morning, my wife looked at me and she said, Vince, why don't you think about going into youth ministry? I'm like, not in the cards, hon. That's not the plan. Later that day, my mom called and she said, Vince, why don't you think about going into youth ministry? And again, I'm like, that's not part of the plan. 2 hours later on the same day, a friend of mine who I hadn't talked to for several months called because he needed to chat about some things, and he heard about what was going on in our story. And he said to me, Vince, the youth pastor at our church just resigned and they want to hire somebody that doesn't have a Bible college degree. I am a little slow. But on April 1st, 1997, I knew what God was asking us to do. And to me, that was that earthquake kind of stuff. And my wife and I were just crazy enough to say, perhaps God wants to do something. I was not trained. I had to take a big cut. I had to get rid of my four-wheel drive pickup truck and the meat in the freezer and the house that was rent-free. It was one of those kind of faith steps that we knew God was calling us, but we weren't sure how it was going to work. Fast forward a couple of years, I ended up getting an invitation to come back and pastor the church in State College where I had attended when I was a student at Penn State. That church was about 50 years old and no adult had ever gone on a mission trip. They thought it was a good idea. They sent some money, but nobody would take the lead on that. And God began to convict me that if it was going to happen, I needed to be the one to take the step. So again, I just started to pray, God, would you give me clarity on how it is, what we're supposed to do as a congregation? And within a week of saying that prayer, I got an invitation to go to Zambia to help build a piggery. So again, God's using animal science with me now as a pastor to get me to Zambia, where for the first time, my wife and I met a whole bunch of orphans. 10% of the population at that time was orphaned because of the HIV and AIDS pandemic. And God started to wreck our hearts while we were there. And as we came back, we realized we needed to tell the story to our congregation of what was happening there in Zambia. And that summer, we had 40 kids that attended a day camp. And those 40 children, as we told them the story, raised $800. And we sent that money over to a friend of ours in Zambia who sponsored 3 children at a school for orphans that already existed. But then he sent me profiles of 15 children who were not going to school, who were not eating food every day, who were sleeping on the ground, and who did not have health care. And as I shared those profiles with my small congregation, individuals almost immediately began to sponsor those 15 children. And my friend then sent me another 15. And before we knew it, our church of about 100 people was sponsoring 46 children. My friend emailed and he said, Vince, we're going to start a school for these children, and we're going to call it State College Christian Church School for the Orphans. We thought, we're a little flattered, but maybe not a great name for your school in Zambia, so will you please rename it? And so they did, and they called it Haven of Hope. And over the next handful of years, we got to see God just start to blow open the doors. There's now 350 sponsored children at 2 schools in Zambia and 1 in Uganda. And God started to use, as we took mission trips over there, the people that were sponsoring these kids got to meet their sponsored child. And just a couple of years ago, we had our first graduates from college. And one of the first sponsors that I took on a trip was a nurse. And her sponsored child just graduated from college and is now a nurse. Another one of those sponsored children was sponsored by another pastor, and that pastor met him 14 years ago, and that kid just graduated from college and is now a pastor in his community. Within couple of years, 30% of my small congregation had now been on a mission trip, and God started to rewrite our story as he was rewriting the stories of several orphans in Africa. I share that because I like to say that it wasn't that my small congregation didn't care. It's they didn't know what the needs were, and they didn't know what the practical next step was to be able to meet the needs. And God rewrote our story. Shortly after we started that sponsorship program, my friend from Africa emailed and he said, Vince, can you come over and do some training of pastors? And again, I'm a cowboy, remember, I'm not trained to do pastor's training. But I thought he'd been working with a group of about 30 pastors, and I thought I can come over and maybe teach some leadership principles to 30 pastors. So I emailed him and said, let me know how many pastors are you thinking about us training, and what do you want the theme to be? And he emailed me back and he says, Vince, there's going to be 500 pastors. Like, wrong guy. He wanted the theme to be Nehemiah 2:17. That verse says a time to rebuild, because there's a church they needed to rebuild after the HIV and AIDS pandemic. But again, it was one of those where my wife and I just said, perhaps God's up to something that we can't see. I had just finished reading a book called Visioneering, and Visioneering was a book written by Andy Stanley, and it was based on the book of Nehemiah. And I emailed Andy Stanley and his ministry, and I said, hey, just got this invitation to go to Zambia and do some pastor's training, and they want this to be the theme. Is there any chance that you'd give us a good deal on 500 of your books? They emailed us back and said, hey, we don't normally do this, but we're going to drop ship 500 of the books for you to use for free. I had another friend that was an author and a speaker who knew that I was going to Africa, and she gave me 100 of her book called The Burning Heart Contract. And we were able to take those books over to Africa, and what God knew before we did, that there was actually going to be 600 pastors at those trainings. And we were able to get a book into each one of those pastors' hands as we were able to spend a couple days with them in 2 different cities. A couple years later, my wife and I were on the streets of Zambia after we had just delivered some gift to the sponsored children. And a pastor comes running across the street yelling, Pastor Vince, Pastor Vince. He says, you're not going to remember me, but I was at this training in Mpika, which was about 8 hours away from where we currently were. And he said, Vince, I just want you to know that that training changed our community. It changed our village. Before that training, our pastors were working against each other. We were in competition. But God used that training to bring us together, to bring unity in our community. And we're still using those books to help us lead our churches and inspire new faith and vision in the people in our churches. And I step back from those things and I just think, only God. What would have happened if I would have went with my first human reaction? It was like, I am not the right person to show up. As a pastor then in State College, I'm meeting weekly with about 12 other pastors, and we're praying together every week. And a few of those pastors started to say, what if we were to do something more intentionally to serve our community together? So it was fertile soil for me to say to those pastors, what if we started an orphan care ministry? And those 12 pastors said, absolutely, let's do that. I asked them, can you find somebody from your church that would be willing as a representative to meet together with representatives from other churches? And those pastors went out and they found representatives, and we began to meet, and within 3 months we became what was the Center County Orphan Care Alliance. I got on an elevator ride with one of our directors at Children and Youth Services, and I said to her, how as a church can we serve your agency? And she looked at me and she said, you guys are the church. You will do one event and we won't hear from you again. Ouch. We have got to rewrite the story in our community. Thankfully, a year and a half later, the Orphan Care Alliance, through the churches in Center County, had become the #1 recruiter of foster and adoptive homes. 3 years later, the agency realized we weren't going away, and they said, can we have a seat at your table? And we've been able to build bridges with them and see God do all kinds of stuff through the relationship with the government and the local agencies in the church. As we got into this 3-4 years into it, we were recruiting a lot of foster families, but we started to realize that they were dropping out just about as fast as we were recruiting them. We've since learned that 90% of foster families don't make it to 2 years. They drop out because it is hard work to take kids with trauma into your space. So we realized we needed to do a better job of supporting those that we were recruiting. So one of the things that we did is we started what was called the James 1:27 email list. And we just said to Jesus followers, if you're willing to sign up to receive an email, We'll send it to you anytime our local agencies have a need. So if they need a crib for a new foster family or a stroller or diapers or clothes, we'll send that need out to this email. And if you can meet the need, you just send us an email back and we'll connect you with the social worker. Over the next couple of years, we saw that list grow from 30 people to 550 Jesus followers that were saying, we're willing to respond. And we've seen God meet so many needs. Last year, it was 22 mattresses. For some reason, mattresses were needed by bio families and foster families. And God used the church to meet those needs. And one of my favorite uses of that list were an agency that needed a mentor for a biological mom who was trying to get her son back, but she needed a new friend group. So we were able to connect her with a church in her neighborhood. She started to come to church. She got her son back about 6 months later, and now they continue to attend that church and are part of a church community. So we realized we needed to do a better job supporting them. If I fast forward just a little handful of more years later, about 2 years ago, we started to feel like God was saying it was time to take what we were doing in Centre County to the other 66 counties in the state of Pennsylvania. There's no other alliances of churches that were working together on this issue in this space. But here's what we do know. There's about 14,000 children in foster care in the state of Pennsylvania. There's about 14,000 churches in the state of Pennsylvania. Right now, there is 2,000 kids, more than 2,000, that are waiting to be adopted. Their parental rights have already been terminated, but they will wait on a waiting list, most of them, for 5 to 7 years before they find a forever family. And it's estimated that 1,100 of those children are going to age out of the system this year with no forever family. And when they age out, 80% of the boys will be in jail before 2 years. 70% of the girls are going to be pregnant and single before they're age 21. And we're just saying that's not okay. When the church does what the church is supposed to do, we get an opportunity to rewrite the story. But yes, it does involve us taking up our cross. Yes, it involves me opening up my home, and I could have been an empty nester a few years ago. Could have been sleeping through the night, not run into a million different activities. But the why gets reinforced for me when, like a couple years ago, 2 years ago, in November, our son was having some seizures. We found a brain tumor he had to have removed. So when we're sitting in Philadelphia in the hospital and he comes out of that surgery and he knows that his mom and I are going to be there when he wakes up holding his hands. It's that moment where I thought about those other 2,000 kids that if they were in the same spot would have no parent there for them. I thought that's what Jesus does for us. He walks from heaven to earth. He kind of walks into our space, into that uncomfortable spot and says, you are mine. I'm going to enter this space with you regardless of how you treat me. You say to these kids that are on the waiting list, these teenagers that may be hard to take, I don't care how bad your attitude gets, you are mine. Yes, it cost us something. But that's what Jesus put his church, the hope of the world, into this community for, is to make sure that none of those kids go without knowing who he is. We want to make him famous. And everyone can do something. So part of our mission at the Orphan Care Alliance is fourfold. We're saying, what if we can find at least 3 foster families in all 500 Pennsylvania school districts willing to take sibling groups and children over the age of 8 years old, because those are the unwanted children, and those are there's no waiting list in school districts for that age group when CYS gets a phone call and needs to place a child. So we're saying, church, can we do that? But let's not leave them unsupported. Let's recruit those foster homes through the local church, but let's make sure before they ever say yes that they have what is called an engineered care community that's willing to wrap around them. And if you volunteer to be on a care community, you're saying, I'm willing to take a meal to that family one time per month Maybe I can help with childcare or transportation to support them. Maybe I can help with laundry or mowing the yard. And here's the deal. When my wife and I had a sibling group of 4 dropped off at our home a few years ago, and we still had 4 of our children living in the home, those children had never sat down to a meal together. It was absolute chaos at our house that night. So when somebody showed up with a lasagna, my wife was like, praise Jesus, we can make it through the night. When we had to get those kids to 4 different schools tomorrow, the following morning, when somebody shows up and says, let me help with transportation, we can keep doing it. So what we've learned that is if we can get an engineered care community wrapping around the foster family, 90% of foster families will still be doing it beyond 2 years. Without that, 90% of them are dropping out before 2 years. We need people from the churches to be armor bearers. They're going to help carry the load for those foster families. On a handout that hopefully you received on the way in, there's a QR code. And if you go to the Care Community QR code, there's a 2-minute video that explains a little bit more how they work and what they're all about. Morgan will share here in just a few minutes, but she's the county coordinator for this region and is equipped to be able to help train local churches to start care communities. So that's the second part of our vision. We want to we want to recruit foster homes. We want to support them with care communities. And then we're saying, what if we can have at least 550 people in all 67 counties willing to respond to tangible needs anytime a local agency has those? A year and a half ago, we hired a company to build out what is now the online portal called Gateway. Gateway is simply, if you would take the time now, and again on a QR code on your handout there, if you go to this site, it takes 2 minutes to register. You're saying, I'm willing to receive an email anytime one of my local agencies has a need. And you'll receive that in your email inbox. If you can meet the need, you click, yes, I can meet the need. It'll put you in touch with the social worker and hopefully then start connecting you with foster and biological families trying to get their kids back. So again, we're saying, what if we could have at least 550 Christ followers in every county ready to respond? And the final part of our mission is just this. We're just saying, what if we could get 39 churches to work together in all 67 counties? We picked 39 just because that's how many we're working together in Center County. And we thought, it's not undoable. We can do this, church. We are better together. Maybe you've heard the story of the draft horses. If you hook one draft horse up, they can pull about 8,000 pounds. If you put 2 of them together, it doesn't double. It triples to about 24,000 pounds. But if you train them together, it quadruples to 32,000 pounds. We're saying, church, let's train together. Let's get representatives together in the same room so we know the needs so that we can rewrite the story, make Jesus famous in our region because the church is doing what the church is supposed to do on behalf of orphans and vulnerable children. Our God is a big God. And I don't know about you, but I want to die with a book full of stories that show that I had the kind of faith that really believed in him and I was willing to seek him. So that's my question to you today is, how big is your God? And if you're sitting on the sidelines, I want to encourage you to put it in gear on a perhaps God will act on your behalf. Because I know that if you're a Christ follower with a pulse, God stirs stuff inside of your heart to start something or to join someone. And you might feel like me, or maybe you're actually like me. You're trained in the wrong field. You're undereducated, you're under-equipped, you're not the right person for the job, but you're available and you're willing. And you're faith-filled just enough to believe that God perhaps wants to use you to win some battles. I'm believing that God put a seed in your heart, a dream, a vision, an idea, a hope, a discontent, and it's yours. So please do something. And if God stirred in your heart even a little bit from some of the stuff that we've been talking about with kids and families from hard places, please get off the sidelines. I'm going to invite Morgan to come up and talk a little bit more about what that looks like here locally.
Hi, One Life. It's good to be here. Some of you may know me. Myself and my family have been coming to One Life off and on for almost 10 years. I was just thinking today that One Life has been a part of my life and my story ever since I was a social worker getting started in York County, Pennsylvania. And it's been really special to be a part of this family. I really appreciate the heart that you all have for the community, and I'm excited for us to share this with you today. For those of you that don't know, I started my career in social work. That's what my training is in. I started working in York County, working with kids and families that were involved with York County children and youth. And that work really broke my heart and made a deep impact on me. It was very hard work, and I often felt as though we didn't really have the resources that we needed in York County to properly care for kids and families. And then I wasn't equipped and didn't have the resources I needed as a case manager to really help them effectively. And during that time, as Vince mentioned, Vince and Beth are family friends of ours, and I was staying up to date with what Vince and his team were doing in Center County. And I remember thinking many times, wow, how impactful would that be if we had that in York County? That's what we need to really help kids and families effectively, and for me to even be more effective as a caseworker. And fast forward to recently, I was really excited to hear that the Alliance was launching across the state, and the timing just worked out really well, and I think it was part of God's plan for me to be able to get involved here in Western Pennsylvania as they were expanding and I was moving back to the farm, and I'm really grateful for that. I know that some of you are already aware of the needs in our community through some of the work that you're doing in the community, but there is a lot of need when it comes to kids and families here in Western Pennsylvania. In Indiana County, there's usually an average of about 75 children in some type of foster care throughout Indiana County at any given time. The number is a little bit smaller for Jefferson, but Jefferson's population is also significantly smaller than Indiana's. And for a little bit of comparison, that number is very similar to what Center County has in terms of kids in care, but since our population is smaller, we probably have a larger percentage of kids in care. That definitely is a concern here. We're hearing as we work with different counties across the state, the labor shortages and difficulties are affecting child welfare really acutely. Most counties are short-staffed in some way. This is especially the case here in Western Pennsylvania, and unfortunately it does impact the care that our kids receive. The kind of positive of this is that as we're approaching county CYS and CYF agencies, we're finding that they're actually really receptive to working with us. We are a faith-based organization. We're very open about that. And yet even these county government organizations are open to working with us. And we believe that they see the need too and are really grateful for some of the help that we're providing and getting the church more engaged. We are still getting started here in Indiana, Clarion, Jefferson area, but there are exciting things happening. We're grateful for what God is doing. We recently launched our first care community in a church in Indiana County around a foster and adoptive family. And it's really beautiful to see how that church is truly wrapping around this family and has already been, but now has some of those supports and training through the care community to support them. We're talking with another church in Indiana that's looking at launching a couple care communities around foster families that they have. There's another church that's starting a foster closet, and our church is getting involved in different ways, and there's a lot of great things happening. There's also been work that's already being done in Clarion through a great volunteer we have up there who's also a foster parent. We'll be having a pastor's breakfast up in Clarion on October 26th, so if any of you happen to have connections through Clarion, through your work or friends and neighbors, I would be happy to connect them with that event coming up if you have those connections. And I've already spoken to some of you that have connections here in Jefferson through your work or what you do. And all those connections are super helpful as we're working on hopefully building out these services in Jefferson too through any connections you have. There's even some overlap with school districts. Vince mentioned that we're working to raise up foster families in school districts so that kids don't have to change districts even when they come into care. And there's even overlap in some of our districts between these counties as well. So that's a big need. But I'd love to talk with you all more about what that would actually look like to get involved with the Alliance in your community, no matter where you live, whether it's Indiana, Jefferson, And I'm just so thankful for all the work that this church is already doing, and would love to see how we can get engaged more in the child welfare system in Western PA. Thank you so much.